people who are whites value politeness and civility at a very high level. So what happens is we don't talk about things that we all know to be true that we don't like. So no one will say, hey, you know what, if you go into a black neighborhood, you're more likely to get mugged. And because no one's willing to say it, and because we don't control our own education system or our child's upbringing, what happens is the next generation doesn't grow up knowing something that everyone in their parents' generation knew. It's a sort of pathological altruism that whites experience, right?
Right.
Where we go ahead and we help people to such an extent where we have destructive behaviors for our own civilization. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you could look at the whole experience of 19th century imperialism through that prism if you want, where basically resources fled from Europe all around the world to advance other civilizations to competitive, at least towards competitive parity and with little practical benefit. Yet we are told, that whites should be blamed for the fact that we brought, things like plumbing to Africa and Asia and other places. When you think about it, it's one of those things where the diversity that has been introduced is a very strange thing, because we have all these other groups brought in here on this sort of myth that anyone can be integrated and anyone belongs in this country. I mean, I think it's a nice national myth, and it fits the sort of, how should I say, the individual way that the right likes to look at things. And I think that couples well with what you said about how we experience this sort of, how should I call it? It's almost like pathos, right? We have this sort of guilt that we express, and now that we don't have families and we don't take care of our own, we try so much harder to convince ourselves that we have some great morality. And so we accept this project as our burden. And I can't imagine any other race would be willing to accept this whole idea of white guilt and white privilege. But we do, and it's an absolutely stunning thing that I think is at the root of why we've let so many things happen. And I think a key point that's missed in all of this, and I talked about this a lot in my chapter on the 50s, was that, and more in the 60s, people who are whites value politeness and civility at a very high level. So what happens is we don't talk about things that we all know to be true that we don't like. So no one will say, hey, you know what, if you go into a black neighborhood, you're more likely to get mugged. And because no one's willing to say it, and because we don't control our own education system or our child's upbringing, what happens is the next generation doesn't grow up knowing something that everyone in their parents' generation knew, unless they come to it later through research and studies or, through experience.
And just to interject, then they become contemptuous of like their grandparents, and they refer to them as my racist grandpa, stuff like that, right? As though there's no reason why their grandpa would be racist.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And they actually get mad at you if you go ahead and speak these truths, because they'll be like, oh, well, you made it that way, or you did something, because they were never prepared for reality. And I think that's a really big part of the problem in America today, which is that what we expect from society has no foundation in reality. I mean, the whole ideological basis of America is radical idealism based on this idea that equality is a great goal. Now, anytime equality has been taken internationally or nationally to its logical extent, I say it ends in one of two places, which is death or squalid poverty, because people are not equal, because people are not the same. Men and women are different, races are different, and it's not just a skin-colored thing. Cultures are different, but we've been denuded of our ability to make moral judgments. So, especially if it's of a protected class. And as people have gotten away from the very utility of reason as a way of understanding things, it's sort of understandable why they just settle into comfortable acceptance and say, okay, well, if I can't make these arguments, why am I even going to bother? And it's this sort of collective apathy we deal with where, people are allowed to have aspirations and dreams, and they're allowed to have wealth and status, but they're not allowed to challenge this dominant paradigm, which is basically to say, all the energy, ambition, and belief in the future that the West once experienced is to be removed and be replaced by something that is more global. And I do believe it is something that is done maliciously by people who, have a vision for where they want the future to go, and seeing, I would say, the countries of the West and the white race generally as the most vigorous threat to that future. We've been targeted for reduction. And there's 2 points I always say. If you want to fix this, 2 things have to happen in America. Number one is you need to wake up Christians away from the sort of Jewish agenda. And number 2 is you need to get white women back. And the way white women come back is when white men begin exerting masculinity. And if there's one thing that bothers me within the movement is the constant sort of shaming and fighting. I mean, you're right that women do terrible things in many cases, but the problem is that's because men abdicated all their responsibilities, and that in the absence of authority, in the absence of families without fathers, women don't know what to respond to. And we as men, in my own belief, have the responsibility to step up and provide that leadership. And every time we spend all of our efforts and energy blaming other people for what we can't do, we come off as a bunch of pussies. Sorry.
Even when we're naming the Jew, right? Because if we say, all these Jews are responsible for all these things happening, it still comes back to, well, why'd you let it happen, white man? If white people are really so great, and then to some degree, they're almost. There's some truth in that. Even Hans Hermann Hoppe pointed it out that none of these pogroms against us would be possible without without the compliance of white people. They absolutely need our compliance in order to pull this off against us. Would you agree with that?
I think that's absolutely the truth, and I think it's incredibly hard to believe, and people don't want to believe it. It's easier to have an omnipotent, all-powerful enemy out there, and to be honest, these people are not that powerful. What they've done, the Jews and the Marxists, whoever you want to split up, is they've been a parasite, right? So how do you take care of a parasite? You fight sickness with health. And we don't talk nearly enough about health. Health is the family. Health is, having a culture worth defending. Health is having pride in our history, pride in our race, and faith in the future. And if we present that optimistic vision in a meaningful way, people are thirsting for this. Women are thirsting for men who exude responsibility and masculinity, and not men who bought into this sort of equality myth where, what do you want? And I'm going to drink soy and I'm going to give you that. Women don't want a man who's going to listen to what they want. Women want a man who stands up for something.